Good morning, afternoon and evening to you all, wherever you are in the world right now. I'm Tim, co-founder of Nudge, and on behalf of us all at Nudge, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome so many of you to this discussion about such an important topic, financial inclusion. Or to be honest, to be more accurate, I should probably say financial exclusion, because that's the problem we've got and we need to fix. The unfortunate fact is that life is unfair, and in large, this is because the personal finance ecosystem just doesn't work for us all. The advice gap, the poverty premium, nepotism, the loyalty penalty, they're all examples of this inequity, and this is serious stuff. The thing is, money isn't optional. Regardless of who we are, our nationality, personality, or even our political persuasion, a proactive relationship with money is critical. And for the progression of humankind as one, we need the personal finance ecosystem to work for everyone, for it to be inclusive, not exclusive, to really embrace diversity, not reject it. And this is big. You know, I'm not silly. I know it's not simple, but from the minute that Jeremy and I co-founded Nudge, we've known that change is possible and that Nudge is going to lead it. And we've identified 3 ways to do so. Firstly, we need to recognise that financial literacy is a human right. UNESCO have long campaigned that literacy is a human right, but this has to include financial literacy too. And the United Nations are with us on this as well. So goals 3 and 4 of their 17 sustainable development goals hit the nail on the head. Just Google UN 17 goals to see this yourself. Just check out goals 3 and 4. And we agree that money, skills and knowledge are the foundation to financial literacy. And those skills and knowledge come from unbiased financial education. So we believe that everyone, regardless of who they are, has a right to unbiased financial education. And only then, with the confidence and control that this brings, can we help people build brighter futures. Secondly, we've got to better use and embrace technology. Our inherent human bias means that the financial system is rigged against huge swathes of humankind, implicitly and explicitly, so consciously and unconsciously. And this is desperately unfair, but used correctly, technology can smash through this bias, break these barriers, and engage people in an equal and equitable way. And lastly, we need business to lead this, and that's many of you. Governments aren't doing enough and just too slow. And so organizations need to step up and make this happen. So whether that's banks, schools, employers, housing associations, insurers, utility providers, we need all of them to use their presence and their resources to drive financial equality. Because of course, not only is it critical for CSR, it's brilliant for business too. We know that diverse, socially conscious organizations perform better. So as you can see, and as evidenced by the UN's recognition, this is a big problem which needs fixing, but it can be fixed. We've got the will, we've got the ideas, we've got the motivation, and we've got the champions to help lead it, many of whom are here with us today, and I'm delighted to introduce now. So first up, we've got the utterly brilliant Tori from HSBC. Now, let me tell you, Tori is a busy lady. So as well as HSBC's Head of Customer Journeys in Everyday Banking, she's also their Diversity and Inclusion Lead and proud owner of the Diversity and Inclusion Influencer Program, which boasts 2,000 members. As if that wasn't enough, she's also co-chair of the Generations Employee Resource Group, focusing on the future of work and nurturing young talent. So thank you, Tori, for joining us. Next up, multi-award-winning disability specialist and social entrepreneur, Shani Dhanda. Now, Shani is an incredible influence, so much so, she was recognised in the BBC's latest 100 Women list as one of the UK's most influential disabled people. She's also founded a number of organisations to improve representation and challenge social inequality. And this includes Diversability that she was telling me about a couple of weeks ago. Sounds absolutely brilliant platform for disabled people, reducing the financial pressures from the unavoidable extra costs that living with a health condition or impairment brings. So welcome, Shani. And we've also then got Hashi Mohamed. Now, let me warn you in advance, Hashi's story is wow, just wow, a real inspiration. So from his arrival in the UK as an unaccompanied child refugee with only basic English, he's now one of the UK's leading junior barristers, a BBC broadcaster and author. His story truly is one of hope and ambition, which he uses to inspire better policy, resilience, focus, and success. And he's sure to add a lot to today's discussion. And lastly, I'm really excited to welcome and introduce David Whitfield, CEO and founder of HR Data Hub. From his 20 years in experience in the world of HR and reward, David saw a gap in the market for richer, more robust, more valuable benchmark data, and HR Data Hub now revolutionizes the way that organizations share and access benchmarking data across all areas of HR, but with relevance today, including diversity, ethnicity, and gender pay gap. And quite simply, what David doesn't know isn't worth knowing. Now, I'd love for you to all contribute to the discussion. So I'm sure we all know how these QR codes now from our NHS check-ins, but so just hover your phone camera over this QR code and it will take you to a web page where you can submit your questions, your thoughts, your comments. That can be publicly or that can be anonymously, and you'll see the QR code in the top right corner of each slide. So if you miss it now, don't worry. So to get us started, let me pass you over to Tori.
Brilliant, thanks Tim, and thanks for the introduction. One of the things Tim didn't mention is I'm also a mum. I've got a daughter, and I also have a son. But part of the reason why I'm particularly passionate around gender and financial inclusion is I was born and raised in Australia in a small town, and my mum didn't work. And that's not unusual. However, one of the things I really observed, and I'll talk about a little bit more in my overview, is the financial dependence that my mum had on my dad was, I felt, very unfair. And so throughout my career, one of the things that I've become more and more passionate about is financial inclusion and how we build that up and how we make it more accessible to our kids as they move through their careers and their lives. I think Tim mentioned that I'm currently head of customer journeys in our retail bank. And one of the big things that, and part of the reason why diversity and inclusion is also such a big part of my career is I think within HSBC, we have an amazing platform to really influence communities all around the world to ensure that financial inclusion is sort of the bread and butter of what we do. And some of the things that I'm going to talk about, in my following slide and also in some of the panel is actually some of those things that we can do that are pretty simple. I think sometimes we overcomplicate what we do in our lives on a day-to-day basis that makes that financial inclusion more complicated than it needs to be. And I think how we simplify that and how we use our diversity lenses to ensure that we're including each and every one of us is really powerful. And I think the amazing things about discussions like this is it really promotes those conversations and ensures that we are making the change where we are each and every one of us responsible for driving those agendas. So part of the discussion is, what are the impacts that gender has had or COVID's had on gender? And I'm going to touch on a few of them because we were already slightly behind, and all the other inclusion lenses or diversity lenses that we'll cover off today are also challenged. But I think if we're truly going to strive to financial inclusion, there are certain key things that we really need to focus on. I think part of the reason why women particularly have been impacted by the economic crisis is we tend to earn less. So women are overrepresented in many of the industries, I think, hardest hit by COVID-19, such as service, retail, and entertainment. So around 40% of all the employed women, which is around 510 million women globally, work in hard hit sectors, compared to around 36% of employed men. I think another reason why I think particularly gender has had a bit of a hit through the COVID is we've got fewer savings. We've got less access to financial education and financial accounts, and that's both within the UK and some of the domestic violence that has happened in the UK, but also globally through the focus on men and empowering men has become more prevalent. I think the other thing that has been a huge impact to women is we're disproportionately represented in informal economies. And what I mean by that is, in terms of our domestic workers and in terms of how we're employed, is very different to our male counterparts. I think the other thing is some of the social protections. So in some of our world economies, women have very different rights to men on a day-to-day basis. Being able to open up a bank account is not always the privilege of a woman. Being able to walk into a branch and sit down and ask questions is not always the privilege of a woman. So actually, some of the social protections, I think, have really exasperated through the financial crisis. I think the other thing that I know that I've definitely felt personally, and I would say my husband has as well, is actually a lot of the unpaid care and domestic work has fallen to the woman to sort of step up and be part of. And I think domestic workers, around 80% of whom are women around the world, in the first wave of COVID in the various markets, 72% of those domestic workers lost their jobs. When you think about that from an economic perspective, that's huge. And not only that, I think they're not protected. So they don't have the basic protections of paid leave, notice periods, or severance leave. So actually, from a confidence perspective, you're losing your way. That basic confidence of being able to establish yourself and that financial independence and the confidence of being an individual is somewhat knocked. I think the last thing for me, and I think why it's important financial inclusion for women, and also the impact from a COVID perspective, is a lot of women make up the majority of single parent households. And I think how we bring that to life and how we support people through that is really critical. So I think they're just a few of the things that I'm just going to touch on today. But I think from my perspective, really how we create that gender balance is really important. And I think through COVID, we've almost seen that exasperated. The figures have grown further apart as a result of that. And the economic impact of this is they're calling it the shadow pandemic. And UN has recently just published a report on this, on the impact of women. The shadow pandemic is the overall impact that we will feel because of this disparity and the growth in the gender divide that's been created as a result of this. So you can see on my slide there under number 5, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these data points because they're quite scary when you look at them. But I think for me, the thing that stood out when I was reading and researching some of this is actually there's around 435 million women and girls that will be living on less than $1.90 a day. And that will push 47 million people into poverty as a result of COVID-19. And that's pretty stark when you think about that. And when you think about the fact that we live in very privileged upbringings and backgrounds, each and every one of us have different experiences, but how do we create that platform where actually we can step into that environment and play a role in balancing out that gender parity? So I think for me, that's kind of what I wanted to touch on as part of my discussion. And I know we're going to go into a panel a bit later, Tim, but I think a lot of this comes down to the importance of financial inclusion, both and it's not complex, it's basic. It's basic financial inclusion, it's education, and it's giving people the basic access rights to establishing bank accounts, talking to people, and creating that environment where people can be open and transparent and ask the basic questions that they need to ask. So that's what I was proposing to cover off. I'm handing over to Shani now to talk about the disabilities and financial wellbeing. Thanks, Shani.
Thanks, Tori. That was a really stark but a really good overview, so thank you for that. And thanks to Tim for my introduction. So I am a disability specialist and I work with organisations to help them become more inclusive for their disabled people and customers. So we all know that, diversity and inclusion has just exploded over the last 18 months or so. And traditionally, what we found is disability is always approached last, even if it's approached to all in some organisations. Despite disability being the largest diversity strand in the world. So if you live with an impairment or a condition, you are part of the world's largest minority group. But it's so ironic that it's not really always part of the broader inclusion discussion. And I'm here today to talk about the disability price tag. So you may or may not be aware that on average, disabled people face many unavoidable extra costs due to living with a condition or an impairment. And on average, these costs add up to £583 a month. Now, this is money that people have to find after paying for, their mortgage, their rent, their food shopping, all your utilities. This is money you have to find after you've paid out all of that everyday stuff. And 1 in 5 disabled people, face extra costs of over £1,000 a month. Now, to me, this is a lot of money to have to find, and I'm sure it is to many other people. And what this means is that essentially for every £100 a non-disabled person has is only equivalent to about £68 for a disabled person. And these additional costs mean that disabled people just have less money in their pocket and simply have to go without, because essentially what we're doing is we're having to pay more to live the same lives as other people, but have less or no choice. And when people ask me about extra costs, well, what do you mean? For example, if somebody uses an electric wheelchair, they're going to have to charge that wheelchair every single night. Therefore, they're going to have a higher energy bill. So it is things like, paying out for equipment, which always seems to cost a lot more when you live with a condition or impairment. At the moment, I need to buy a new wheelchair. That's £5,000 just to buy that. My travel insurance is about £1,000 for an annual policy because I have a pre-existing medical condition. And I've lived my entire life with my condition, so this is all I've ever known. And work and finding work has been something that's been massively important to me, because I just continually, as a child, felt massively guilty that my parents had to keep paying out for really expensive stuff. When I was in secondary school, I needed an electric wheelchair and that cost £7,000. I'm a child of immigrants. They have manual labour jobs, just didn't have that kind of money lying around. And, even with the support from welfare payments, it just doesn't reflect the true current living of the cost of living. So it's really falling short of disabled people meeting these extra costs. I also want to point out that nearly half of everybody living in poverty is either disabled or they live with a disabled family member. And when your capacity to get out of poverty is largely based on getting employment, it goes without saying that disabled people should have the same job opportunities as everybody else, but it's just simply not the case, because we know that disabled people are twice as likely to be unemployed. They have to apply for 60% more jobs. And when applying for jobs, only half of applications even result in an interview. So there's a massive disconnect here. And we know that, especially in the UK, there are at least 1 million disabled people that can and want to work, but they aren't being given the opportunities due to this massive stigma that we have in employing disabled people. And essentially what we're doing is judging people's abilities on the fact that they live with a condition or an impairment. So lastly, I just want to raise awareness of the disability pay gap as well. So if and when disabled people do get into work and are offered a job opportunity, then they are faced with a disability pay gap, which means that they effectively work for free for the last 2 months of the year. Now, I don't know anyone that would work free for 2 months of the year, and especially when you're already being faced with extra costs, then you're being faced with this massive pay gap. And then if we look through an intersectional lens about this pay gap, it's going to get even bigger if you're a woman, if you are from an ethnic minority background. If you continue to add on the layers, it's just going to get even wider and wider and wider. And finally, these stats don't reflect what's happened during COVID and the pandemic. And what we know is that disabled people are the first group of people that are being made redundant. So I'm using technology to help build financial inclusion, and I'm launching a discount platform with Diversibility to help tackle the root cause of the problem and to help reduce disabled people's outgoings. That's me. I'm now going to hand over to Hashi.
Just before Hashi starts, if I could just remind people we've had a few questions submitted, but there's the ability to submit questions through the Slido. Sorry, Hashi.
No, not at all. Thank you very much for that, Tim, and thank you to Shani. I'm honestly sitting here, a mouth open, thinking to myself, there's so much that I didn't understand before that I'm learning, especially from what I've just heard from both Tori and Shani. I come at this in a slightly different perspective, really, because I had recently written a book called People Like Us, What It Takes to Make It in Modern Britain. And my background, which Tim touched upon very briefly, is that I came to the UK as a young unaccompanied child refugee. Both my parents were never formally educated. My mother gave birth to 12 children. This is a woman who's started childbearing at the age of 14. And then, if life wasn't more difficult than it could ever have been, my father had passed away when I was 9 years old. And we found ourselves in the United Kingdom, having been scattered as a family across the world, with some of my siblings in America, some of my siblings in Canada, all across the European Union, and even some of my cousins ending up in Stockholm, where I am right now. And it is impossible to underscore the challenges that come with essentially starting out in life in a completely new world about which you know nothing, in a new language, in a new culture, in a new way of life, and try and build a life which then is somehow sustainable, financially secure, and outward looking. And in my book, I kind of tackle a lot of the stories of how then I ended up to be where I am now, as a barrister, as somebody who has qualified in that well-known, apparently very elite profession, broadcasting a lot of my ideas on the BBC, and what actually happened. What is it that made me who I am? What was the sort of steps that took place that led me to the life that I lead now? And it's a huge task, and I wouldn't spend too much time talking about it here. But one of the things I wanted to tackle upon about the question about financial inclusion is that the book is ostensibly about social mobility. Now, when we think about social mobility, it's essentially the question of, are you doing better than those who came before you? You heard Tori talking about, the challenges that her mum might have felt in terms of being financially independent, or Shani talking about essentially worrying about whether or not she was a burden to her parents because of her disability. And in the story of social mobility, when you are trying to do better than those who came before you, a big part of it is overcoming a lot of barriers and mentality issues to where you want to be. And the one I would touch upon here is, for example, getting a law degree, getting a master's, and then training to become a barrister, going to the bar, is effectively, when I was growing up, close to something like £50,000 to £60,000. If You look at it today, you're looking at something like £150,000. Now, if you've come from a financially precarious background, like I did, where I was raised exclusively on state benefits, where nobody worked in my family, where we were refugees, basically, with scant resources, it's not very easy to then say to yourself, I am going to embark on a course of becoming a barrister one day and get there without being mentally just stuck at the proposition that I'm going to get myself into a significant amount of debt in order to one day be debt free. And that is a big part of understanding the question of financial inclusion in my mind. And I think what Tim was talking about there of schools might be focusing on literacy and numeracy, but I don't remember anybody teaching me about mortgages, about how to actually budget, how to think about the fact that if you're going to get student loan at 1 or 1.5%, it's probably better than any interest rate that you're ever going to get from a bank, and that you need to have your eye on the prize of a bigger picture in the future, and so on and so forth. And so for me, that is a big critical part of the social mobility story. It's not enough for you to pass exams and want to work hard and want to push yourself and want to succeed and be determined, but you need a huge part of understanding about the society in which you are going to function, understanding how you're going to change the course of your destiny. And a large part of that, in my mind, is in relation to understanding how the financial systems work, both where you are at that particular moment in your life and where you're trying to get to. So I'll stop there, Tim, because I think I could keep going on in relation to that. But I think that is the main takeaway I hope people will have, is social mobility is not something that just happens overnight, but financial understanding and understanding of your where you are and where you want to get to in terms of your finances is a critical part of that. I'll hand over to David now for his part. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hashi. Just an incredible story, so thank you for sharing. I'm going to look at the ethnicity pay gap. We at HR Data Hub have done a huge amount of research in this area over the last year and a half. It does just apply to the UK at the moment. We are a complete benchmarking platform, so we do cover all areas, as well as reward, D&I, etc. And we're supported by an amazing community. So this amazing community comes together to provide us with data, with insights, so we can provide real evidence back to companies and to government to hopefully influence change. This is some of the ethnicity pay gap research that we have collected from open source, but also more importantly, directly from our community. So in the UK, the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, they did their report, I think a couple of months ago now. They reported a little to no pay gap for ethnic minorities in the UK. They said it was 2.3%, but the data source themselves admitting was flawed and was very concerning to us. It's almost a job done. There's no issue here around financial inclusion for people with ethnicity, because actually they're being paid the same broadly as everybody else, which again is extremely worrying. So the actual medium ethnicity pay gap, a sample taken from our platform, represents 228 companies. And these are very big companies. So the data points are into the millions. It's actually 12%. So 12% is the actual pay gap for ethnicity in the UK from the companies that we've seen. And it does differentiate again by different sectors, etc. And this obviously creates a wealth gap between the different protected characteristics of ethnicity. And also why representation at every level matters. So what we get is a lot of companies say, we've got brilliant representation in our company. It's in line with the UK census at 14%, And broadly, that's right for a lot of companies, which is great to get the representation overall, but it matters at every level. So we just took a sample of 90,000 employees and said, okay, where do they sit in terms of their pay levels if they're part of an ethnic minority? And shockingly, 70% sat at the minimum or living wage. And then, as you can see here, as they go up, very, very few individuals actually start to hit, above 50K, which is very concerning for us in terms of the levels of representation in the companies where individuals can start to get to the right level of financial independence. I know we're tight on time today, so just to let you know, we do have all of this data in some research reports, which we're more than happy to share through Nudge if they're happy to circulate it. So we have lots of research in terms of what you can do to try and address the ethnicity pay gap and representation at different levels. This is what other companies are doing in terms of frequency on the left-hand side there. On the right-hand side, what we looked at is 3 years of pay gap history, and we looked at the frequency of measures used by companies that have managed to close that gap over that 3-year period. So in the green arrows are the ones which show more frequency in those companies, and the red is less frequency. So you can see on there, ethnicity data collection, analysis, putting in place actions at work is the most important thing that people are doing right now to try and address the ethnicity pay gap. And indeed, we've done analysis. We've got an ethnicity pay gap database on our platform of the 120 companies that have self-reported in the UK. Just as a little bit of a step, really, we also did a Outlook 21 survey asking 156 companies just in terms of what their focus is for this year and what they've done through COVID as well. And one of those was on financial benefits. And if you look in the green bars there, you can see that employers have really started to step up and enhance a lot of the benefits that they've got around financial well-being and looking to implement them, which is great from our perspective. The acknowledgement of companies around financial well-being is so much better than it was when I was in the corporate world some 5 years ago. In particular, looking at the financial well-being platform and advice as well. But a lot to be done still. As you can see in the red, still lots of companies are not really seeing the light in terms of the impact that financial benefits can have on inclusion. So in summary, we have seen UK ethnic minorities are kind of paid 12% less in the UK and are likely to be in a lower paid role. And this is obviously just looking at one characteristic, as Shani mentioned earlier. Once you start overlaying gender and disability, etc., sexual orientation, these numbers tend to get a lot worse from the research that we've done. In terms of a data journey, we get asked this quite a lot. So what can we do to fix this? We saw the events of last year with George Floyd. There was lots of just stuff going on, but there wasn't a lot of focus. So we advocate that companies actually create the right business case to get the commitment from their board, build trust within their organization, define what data to collect, then start collecting the information. I'd go far beyond ethnicity, by the way, is trying to get information across all of the different protected characteristics. Only then do you start doing the analysis, setting the targets, and then you create the action plan that matters for you in terms of closing those gaps, tracking the progress, and finally, what's really important is to celebrate the successes, but also the challenges that you have and be open and honest with your colleagues. And we built a guide around that as well, which again, might be quite useful. So that was it for me. So thank you very much for listening. So I think I'm going to hand back to you now, Tim.
Thank you so much, David, Hashi, Shani and Tori. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at the Slido, but yeah, we've got some really great questions there and comments. So yeah, it's a really inspiring set of experiences and stories that you've told there. Just to pick out a few that I guess a few questions that captured my attention. So Tori, you talked about how COVID growing the gap, and you used the phrase that the shadow pandemic, which isn't something I'd heard before, but the fact there's 47 million new people pushed into poverty. Do you think we were making progress before that? So has that accentuated a downward trend anyway, or has that put us back a bit?
Yeah, it's put us back a bit, sadly. So I think before the pandemic, we were seeing the gap narrow. And I think since COVID has hit, that has only widened. And actually they're expecting that to, I think by the end of this year, they're expecting that to almost double where it was. So I think what they're saying is that the loss that we've made since the pandemic has set us back 40 years in terms of creating that gender parity, which is a bit of a kick in the teeth when you feel like you've done as much as you can to drive things forward for your kids. So unfortunately, it's kicked us back that far.
Okay, no, thank you. And Shani, it was shocking to hear a couple of bits jumped out from me. So the £100 for a non-disabled person equals £68 for a disabled person, and I used that stat in some of my promo of this event. It's ringing through my head since you mentioned to me a few weeks ago, and then obviously the pay gap. Clearly there's a stark financial inequality faced by many disabled people, but many people don't know about it. So the fact that those stats have stood out to me, why do you think we don't know about those, such monumental numbers and differences?
Yeah, I think it's a whole host of reasons, really, but I think it just comes back to the point that I initially made. Disability is always the poorer sibling in the diversity and inclusion agenda, despite, this being a diversity strand that anybody can be part of literally overnight, because, your ethnicity is not going to change overnight. If you're going to change a gender, there's going to be a process in doing that. But I just don't think people understand the prevalence or actually what we even mean when we talk about disability. So quite often people think that it's a condition or impairment that actually disables you, but it isn't. It's actually society and the way in which the world is designed and people's bias. Those are actually the disabling barriers. So I think people just sort of see it as the individual's own thing to fix, but we know, in inclusion that's just not how we get equality or equity. And I also think that businesses and brands just don't realise how much of an overlooked consumer group disabled people are. We're talking about 22% of the UK population. That's 1 in 5 of us. And, in an organisation or a customer base, that's at least 20% of your customer segment. And they also have we have a spending power of £274 billion to the UK economy. And I'm, through diversity, through technology, I'm trying to help businesses really understand the demand for the demand on their products and services by disabled people. And, if there's anything people go away with today, learning, I just want them to think of designing for their future selves. We are living longer as a population. We are developing chronic health conditions at a much younger age. Let's think inclusively and through an intersectional lens, because we are all intersectional, whether that's outwardly noticeable or not. That's the reality.
And it was striking hearing about the impact on insurance and how much more expensive insurance is for disabled people. Is there any support to help with that? So are there specialist insurance companies, or do they accept a lower profit margin, or is there government support, or is it just hard luck? And of course that then means that people are less likely to insure themselves, and the result is even bigger in terms of financial exclusion.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing out there that actually recognises that disabled people are facing all these extra costs, and businesses and brands doing something about it. Sadly, what they see is just as a business opportunity. People really need this thing, so let's just hike up the price. I've never had to claim on my travel insurance, but I can't equally afford to take the risk of traveling without it. So yeah, this is why I guess the work that I'm doing is so important, but I can't do it single-handedly. So if there are any organizations today that, you know, want to get involved, this is a massive opportunity for you. So, you know, as all the others have shared as well. So please do get involved and help us.
Yeah. And on the subject of travel, so Hashi, you were talking about the fact you're in Sweden at the moment, and I think you said you've got relatives in the US as well. Yeah, how do their experiences differ to what you've experienced in the UK?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I'm married to a Swedish woman, and a lot of my family and siblings are scattered around the world, and it's always quite interesting because when we think about the financial circumstances that they all are in now, it's a completely different ballgame. If I think about the refugees and those who sought asylum in America, for example, they still remain to this very day in a much more financially precarious position because of the way American society naturally is. The welfare state is really non-existent, and you have to essentially fend for yourself. The other extreme is where I am now in Sweden, where the welfare state is pretty robust and bloated and full of cash. And so, you know, I think about my brother-in-law who is a doctor and gets 9 months, 80% paid paternity leave, you know, in a place like Stockholm, where he goes to a gym where dads have a little creche to leave their little kid whilst he uses the gym. I mean, I could never dream of anything like that in the UK. And I guess he is in the middle of those two extremes. But the point that is really critical for places like Nudge and virtual inclusivity is that I really think that, especially for newcomers or people who are trying to find the space to think, to innovate, to genuinely make a difference in their lives, if you are completely and utterly consumed by money worries, there is very little space in your mind and in your heart and in your soul to be able to think about a better future, to actually plan for such a better future. And I think that in a place like Sweden, perhaps a bit too extreme on one end, and a place like America, extreme on the other end, that level of space to be able to think is what I think can make all the difference in somebody who's trying to become more socially mobile. And we have to try and find that space to give people that ability to do that. Yeah.
And I've just noticed the world map behind you. So that's a perfect seating position for you, Hashi.
Yeah.
Extra points for you. David, quick question for you. So you talked about, you summarised how ethnic minorities earning 12% less. Apologies if I missed it, but did you talk about which way that's trending? Is that gap improving or getting worse?
That's a super question, and we have a serious lack of data in this area. So this is almost brand new data baseline from that perspective. So for the first time, we are collecting data from companies on ethnicity pay gap. So it's very difficult to see how that's trending currently. There are some companies that have declared their ethnicity pay gap, but only over the last 2 or 3 years. So again, it's very difficult to see the trend data. From those companies, we see it broadly flat or some marginal gains. We're not seeing anything significant. Very similar to gender, actually, where we see very glacial changes to the gender pay gap because it's around broader society issues as well as companies as well. And these changes take time to implement. And ethnicity data is pretty poor. And to Shani's point, I just want to jump in to say disability, I tell you what, it's just, nobody's talking about it. It's just shocking, really. It really is. It's so disappointing. And talk about lack of data. Wow, you just can't get data on disability. You can get age, gender, some ethnicity, but beyond that, there's just a real big dearth of data. If you don't have data, you don't understand the problem, do you? It's very difficult to fix it. So, Shani, I share your pain from a certain perspective, anyway. But I just want to try and get companies to start collecting data. It's really important.
And I wonder, on the subject of income gap, so we've had a great question here from somebody anonymous on the Slido. Such a powerful sharing of experiences. Do the speakers have a view on basic minimum income for all? So that's the first part of the question. So I know, I mean, I'm listening to Radio 4 as I do. Universal income came up a few times in discussion over the last year, particularly, I guess, off the back of furlough. I don't know if anybody on the panel's got any thoughts on that and whether that can be one of the tools to help solve this problem.
You know, I'm a bit of a skeptic on this one. I think it's a great ideal, but I think the reality of it, I just feel as a society we're so far from achieving that. I mean, you know, Shani, talking about disability, I always think disability is actually, we are disabling people. But then talking about, as society, we're disabling people. People aren't disabled, we are disabling. And so when you think about, you know, creating a minimum wage for, I just think we're so far away from that. I'm sure Hashi's got an opinion on this as well, but my opinion is we're too far.
My own thoughts are, I'm also a bit of a skeptic. I've been looking at this issue of universal income quite a bit. I know that they were trying something in not far from where I am in Finland recently, and also in places in a small village in Kenya. But my own thoughts are that in principle it seems like a great idea, but in practice I think it can be a difficult issue for three main reasons, really. The first is that we have to understand that there is an element of human instinct in all of this. There are those human beings for whom a basic income would be liberating mentally, to be able to really transpose themselves in a position where they can make a big difference. But then there are those for whom it would be a very limiting thing, in the sense that some people want that urgency and that kind of push. And I certainly, for example, this is really interesting, and I reflect on this in the book, having come from where I've come from, raised on benefits with all that financial insecurity, even though I'm technically now in a position where, you know, I'm a homeowner, I am financially secure, I've got a decent income, a decent pension, holiday pay, and sort of life insurance, and all these things, I still have that precarious feeling inside me where I'm thinking to myself, this could all go tomorrow. And there is a huge element of motivation that comes with that. And so my question about that, then the second point is, to what extent would a basic universal income curtail that? And to what extent would it really destroy that human instinct to want to push yourself? And then the final thing is that a basic universal income has to be paid for by someone, right? It's not going to be something that will come out of anywhere. And I think for me, one of the big problems with the way that it's currently being pushed is that if you don't bring a whole community and whole of society with you or under the idea, you will end up start building a resentment within a society for which some people will say we should have it, and other people will resent the fact that they have to pay for it. So that's sort of my instinctive thing, where I think it's a good idea, but in practice it might be difficult. But then also, what about those people who don't want to pay for it?
Yeah, no, fantastic.
I agree with both Tori and Hashi, their points. And me, what I would really like to see first is the current welfare system and process actually being fit for purpose. So, you know, recently, disability living allowance was overhauled and turned into something called personal independence payments. But the assessment just isn't fit for purpose, and over 600,000 disabled people have actually lost any type of support, and many have had to go to tribunals if they've had the energy, where a lot of cases have got to be overturned. So I think, you know, talking about an equitable approach here, for me, that's what I would want to see first.
And I'm really interested to understand what the panel thinks in terms of how employers can support the various challenges that we've talked about. So Yeah, I mean, there's probably 8 or 9 questions that we've had through various means on this. So who'd like to contribute to that? What more can employers do? Tori?
I'm happy to go in there. So I think David's your guy. So data. I think understanding the data is a good starting point. I think for me as well, particularly with gender, but also with disability and actually all the inclusivity lenses, is policies. So looking at how policies are developed so that they support both internally within your companies, but also, you know, campaigning governments as well. So policy changes are adapted. I think the other one for me is, and I think you touched on at the beginning as well, is promoting digital financial inclusion. So how do we get digital financial inclusion to be the bread and butter of what we do day in, day out? I think there's a fourth one for me, and I think it's around removing the barriers to financial inclusion. And I mean things like education and training, providing people basic physical access to financial institutions. So disability access, women being able to walk into branches to ask questions, setting up branches in rural communities so that, you know, people have access to some of that literacy. And I think the last one just linked to that is the simplicity. How do we just make it simple? Why do we overcomplicate this stuff? Why do we need to know the ins and outs of interest rates, or how to set up an account, or how to save money? Just keep it simple. That whole KISS, keep it simple, stupid, I think is where we kind of need to get to. So that's my opinion on those. From an employer's perspective, I think for me, they are some of the key things.
Yeah. Shani, Hashi, don't know if you've anything to add there.
I do, but I want to let David go first.
What more can employers do?
I guess
saving him for the crescendo.
It's all right, don't worry. It's like, do you want me to go, or it's up to you?
Yeah.
I guess from my perspective, I think what we haven't talked about, I don't think, is the real living wage as well. Is getting companies to, particularly in the UK, is to sign up and make a pledge to real living wage. I think that's a good start. The concern I've got is a lot of low-paying sectors where, unfortunately, you do find a lot of people in the ethnic minorities, they're not willing to go that far because of the impact that will have on the business, and rightly so, because that will, obviously, people is a big part of the service industry, for example. So if they can collectively, as a sector and industry, commit to real living wage, that could make a huge impact just on getting pay right, which is really important. So getting pay right is one, and then making sure they're recognising talent and getting that talent through the company into the higher level roles. And then there's a whole other stuff that Tori talks about is around the whole support mechanism behind that, and that is around financial education and financial well-being, and making sure they get very most from their money and they're supported from the company. So it's kind of getting the equity right, and then having that framework behind it as well to make sure they do make very best of the money they've got.
Tim, could I offer just two very quick points on that as well? What I always find fascinating, and I think what Tori was talking about there about simplicity is absolutely critical. I work in planning and environment law now, which is predominantly around trying to build housing, and in particular affordable housing. And one of the things, for example, Tori was saying about sort of the idea of interest rates. But if, for example, right now, you are a first-time buyer and you're trying to get on the property ladder and you're trying to convince a bank to take a risk on you and to give you a mortgage, they'll look at a bunch of things. But one of the things they will never look at for some odd reason is if you are somebody who's been paying rent to somebody else's mortgage for the best part of 10 years, somehow banks don't actually have a mechanism of looking at that as a potential track record for you being a reliable person to lend money to. If you get on the property ladder and you do have a bank that takes a mortgage on you, and then you've been paying your mortgage, say, for 3, 4, 5 years, next bank they go to, if you don't like the interest rate that's being given to you by your current bank, will say, oh, he's been paying, obviously, this other bank for 5 years. He must be great. He must be financially secure. So it's small nudge, or whatever you might call it, twists of the system that I think could help so many people. And if there was a mechanism of giving people the opportunity to be like, I've been paying rent for 10 years, I'm not bankrupt, look how much I've been able to show. Those are the kind of things that I think if we did a few steps right and left, could move the dial for a lot of people's lives.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, I'm conscious of time. I mean, I think we could continue for hours, but I'm conscious that you know, we've come to the end of our slot. So an incredible session. Clearly, there are huge problems, but I think also encouragingly, you know, some practical steps that we can all take as well. I think, as I said at the beginning, we've got the will, you know, we've got the ideas, and that was clear from that panel discussion. And what's clear is we've also got the motivation. I saw that from the questions that were coming through on Slido as well. And we've got the champions to drive the change needed. I'm sure there are some passionate people with great ideas amongst the audience too. So please continue to contribute to the debate. We'll welcome your contact and discussion, whether that's to your usual nudge contact or feel free to contact me directly. So what's next from here? We'll follow up with a recording and a summary of this session. For those of you with global people responsibilities, please join our Global Financial Wellbeing Forum on the 15th of July. Our first global event was an absolute belter, so I know this will be brilliant too. And if, as an organisation, you're ready to do your bit and introduce financial education that we spoke about there for your employers, look out for the Financial Wellbeing Playbook, which will be in the follow-up to this session as well. We've got lots of clients on this call as well. Expect to hear more from us to you through Steve or your usual contacts as well. So thank you again to our speakers, Tori, Shani, Hashi, and David. This really feels like the start of a movement to recognise financial literacy as a human right, not a birthright. Goodbye.